Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Today, my group will present on topic sectional completion and partial occupation. But before that, let me introduce myself and my group members. I am Izaliana and I will explain on sectional completion. Meanwhile, my other two group members, which are Nur Akila Natasha and Nik Nur Akid Shafira, will explain on partial occupation. For the sectional completion, firstly, what is the sectional completion? Sectional completion is where the construction contract splits the works into sections or parts which are usually to be started at different times, and there will be multiple completion dates set by the employer in respect of those different parts of the works. Sectional completion is a common practice, especially on large projects that are completed in sections. As large projects take a long time to be completed, the employer has to wait for a long time before he could expect return on his investment. Therefore, by practicing sectional completion, it allows the employer to occupy the completed parts whilst construction continues on the other parts. For instance, in a residential development, the employer may begin promoting and selling the units of houses that have been completed instead of waiting for the whole development to be completed. Hence, the sectional completion can allow the employer to begin recouping some of its build costs earlier. Sectional completion requires particular care to be taken with respect to, firstly, the issues with on-site logistics when different parts or sections are in the hands of different parties. Logistics can be defined as the movement of materials and equipment from where they originate to where the workforce needs them. So the contractor may face difficulties in managing the logistics on site if the employer takes the possession of the completed parts. This is due to the construction of the remaining works is still ongoing. So the possession may interrupt the contractor's work. Secondly, the contractor should consider to provide the protection of the completed sections in order to avoid any accidents from occurring on site. And the last, the contractor should consider effective health and safety measures to address the risks arising from the occupation of areas adjacent to, close to, or accessible only through ongoing construction work. Moving on to the next slide. This is the timeline for sectional completion. So let's say there is one project which consists of three phases, which are phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3. So here we can see clearly that each section or phase of works has its own timeline. However, at the end, the three phases are still under one same contract document as a whole project. With reference to the PWD 223 Form of Contract Revision 2010, sectional completion is mentioned in clause 41. So in clause 41.1, sectional completion is referring to a provision which allows different completion dates to be fixed for different sections or parts of the construction works. Sectional completion is predetermined or pre-planned where the contractor has been informed by the employer at the tender stage. The works to be completed and handed over in sections or phases must be expressed and identified in the appendix or in the contract document. So this is how the appendix looks like. And this is the example on how the details of the sectional completion written in the appendix. So basically, the identification of sections or parts, the date for possession, the date for completion, and the liquidated and ascertained damages must be clearly identified and mentioned in the appendix. So in this example, we can see that there are three blocks in section, which are block X, block Y and block Z, and we can see that they may have different date for possession and date for completion. And for block X, the liquidated ascertained damages is 2,000 ringgit per day, block Y 2,500 per day, and block Z 2,200 per day. So next is the effect or significance of sectional completion. Each section or part of the works must be completed before or on the completion date specified for the section or part. Each section or part will have its own Certificate of Practical Completion (CPC) that will be issued by the SO. Each section or part will have different and separate extension of time for delay of each section. If the delay occurred is not because of the contractor's fault, the SO may grant the contractor delay and EOT in accordance to the section or part involved separately. Secondly, liquidated and ascertained damages for non-completion of the sections or part. If the contractor failed to complete the section or part of the works by the date of sectional completion that has been specified, due to his own fault, the SO may issue a Certificate of Non-Completion (CNC), and the employer entitles LAD per day to recover from the contractor until the works completed. The LAD period is from the issuance of CNC to the date of issuance of CPC. Third, defects liability period will start immediately after completion of section. After completing the section or part of works and getting the CPC, the DLP for each section or part of works will start, and the DLP is 12 months from the date of sectional practical completion. And last, Certificate of Making Good Defects CMGD for that particular section or part will be issued upon making good defects. If there is any defect appears in the section or part of the works during the LP, the SO should issue schedule of defects of the section to the contractor not later than 14 days after the expiration of the LP. The contractor obligates in making good all the defects specified in the schedule of defects at his own cost within 3 months after the receipt of the schedule. Next, these are the following that are not affected by sectional completion. First is the insurance of the works, as insurance of the works covers the whole works and not by section or part of the works. Secondly, performance bond. The performance bond will only be released or refunded to the contractor upon receipt of the CMGD for the whole of the work. And the last one, final certificate needs to be issued only once in one project, which is 3 months after the issuance of CMGD of the whole works. In clause 41.2 in PWD mentions that the contractor is not entitled to the release of the whole or any part of the performance bond or performance guarantee sum deposited by him after the sectional completion. The performance bond and performance guarantee sum can only be released or funded upon the issuance of the CMGD of the whole works or the last section of the works, which in the case of the sectional completion. Next, in PAM Contract 2018, the relevant contractual regarding sectional completion are mentioned in clause 21.2 and clause 21.3. So basically, in clause 21.2, it explains that if there are different commencement dates for section of the work, the date should be mentioned in the appendix as below. So here is the column that needs to be filled up for the date of commencement. Next, clause 21.3. If the sections of the works have different completion dates expressed in the contract document, the architect will issue a certificate of sectional completion after the section is completed. Each section will have separate and different practical completion, defects liability period, extension of time, liquidated damages, and also release of retention fine. So for the next slide is the comparison between PWD and PAM 2018. So the relevant contractual regarding sectional completion in PWD is mentioned in clause 38.3 and clause 41. Meanwhile, in PAM 2018, the clause related is in clause 21.2 and clause 21.3. So for the sectional commencement in PWD 203A revision 1 2010, sectional commencement is explained in clause 38.3. where the possession of site and other restriction upon possession of the site in sections or parts of the works must be mentioned in the appendix or contract document. Meanwhile, in PAM 2018, the sectional commencement is explained in clause 21.2, where the details of the different commencement dates for section of the works must be recorded in the appendix. Next is about the sectional completion. The clause related in PWD is clause 41, where the different completion dates for different part and section of the work must be stated in the appendix or in the contract document. Second, all provisions in the contract in regards to CPC, delay and EOT, LAD and DLP will apply to each section as it is a separate and distinct contract between the government and the contractor. Meanwhile, in PAM 2018, the sectional completion is explained in the clause 21.3, where the details of different completion dates for sections of the works must be stated in the contract document. The architect to issue a certificate of sectional completion when the sections or part of the works are practically completed, and all provisions in the contract in regards to CPC, TLP, EOT, liquidated damages and release of retention sum will apply to each section as if it is a separate and distinct contract. So for the court case for the sectional completion is in the case of Vinci Construction UK Limited versus Bumer Group UK. So basically in this case, Vinci was employed to carry out works at Gatwick Airport South Terminal and Bumer was subcontracted to carry out works to the baggage handling system. By October 2014, the subcontract works were in delay and the parties entered into a settlement agreement that extended 2 sectional completion dates. Subsequently, a dispute arose over the operation of the extended sectional completion dates and the liquidated damages payable. So as the decision, in the latest Technology and Construction Court application, Vinci sought to enforce an adjudicator's decision that Vinci was entitled to recover 9.7 million sterling liquidated damages from Bumer for the delay done by the Bumer. I think that's all for sectional completion, and the presentation will then be continued to the partial occupation. With that, thank you.
Next slide is partial occupation based on PWD Form 203A 2010. Under clause 42.1, partial occupation happens when the employer takes early possession of a section or sections of the works with the agreement of the contractor while the work is in progress. The provision allows for any part of the completed works be handed over to the employer before practical completion of the whole works. Consent of the contractor is required here before the employer takes over any part of the works. The contractor consent is not to be unreasonable withheld. The contractor is bound to give his consent to the government request for partial occupation. Without such consent, the employer will be in breach of his obligation to give the contractor complete possession of site until completion if he occupies any part of the works. There are 6 effects of partial occupation. The first one is certificate of partial occupation. Under clause 42.1a, CPO of the works to be issued by the SO for each section taken over by the employer. How long? Within 7 days after taking over the relevant section by the employer. The CPO must state the estimated value of the relevant section. Okay, what about defect liability period? Under clause 42.1b, once the section is taken over by the employer, the LP for that section starts immediately. The section is deemed to have reached practical completion, but no formal certificate of practical completion is issued for the section. The certificate of practical completion is not issued for each relevant section, but will be issued only once on the completion of the whole work. Under clause 42.1c, Certificate of Making Good Defects or CMGD for that section will be issued by the SO. after they are satisfied with the making good of defects once the DLP expired. Liquidated and ascertained damages. Under Clause 42.1d, LAD for the remainder of the works has to be reduced in the proportion which the value of the relevant part bears to the contract sum. No allowance is made for any variation. So here I provide an example to calculate LAD for remainder of the works. Basically, insurance of the works and performance bond are not affected. Under Clause 42.1e, the insurance of the works is not affected. This is to cover for the whole works inclusive of the sections occupied by the employer. But the contractor must notify the insurance company of the partial occupation. Under Clause 42.1f, performance bond also to cover for the whole works and to be released upon issuance of certificate of completion of making good defects for the whole works.
The next slide is about PAM 2018. In PAM 2018, for the clause partial occupation, it is known as partial possession by employer. Partial possession by employer is an early occupation toward any part or section of works before practical completions. This means that the employer can taking over any part or section of works before the whole works of the project is done. The reason of partial possession by employer is because demand in business or commercial purpose. If for the demand in business, it may be because the business need to start as soon as possible because of the current demand and price is high. For the commercial purpose, it is delay in commencement date of work so that there is a need to complete early. As a solution, partial possession have been taken over for some sections. The effects of partial possession by employer are: the first one is achieve practical completion to any part or section of which partial possession is given. For example, if the employer has wished to occupy any part or sections, the works there must be fully complete first. The second one is half retention for that part is released. Retention there mean as retention sum. Retention sum is monies deducted and retained by employer from sums otherwise payable to the main contractor under a construction contract. The third one is defect liability periods begin to start. The fourth is liquidated ascertained damages will be reduced proportionally. And the last one is issuance of certificate making good defects. Partial possession by employer has two conditions, which are with the consent and without consent. There are a few differences in PWD 203A, Stroke 2010 and PAM 2018. For the first differences is relevant contractual regarding partial occupation. For PWD, it is stated in Clause 42, which is partial occupation or taking over by the government. Meanwhile, for the PAM 2018, it is stated in the Clause partial possession in the Clause 16, which is partial possession by employer. The next is partial occupation. In PWD, in Clause 42.1, partial occupation can be achieved anytime before the works reach practical completions and with the consent of contractor. For the PAM 2018, it has two clauses, which are Clause 16.1 with consent and Clause 16.2 without the consent. For the Clause 16.1, partial occupation can achieve anytime before the works reach practical completion. Practical completion there means the whole works is done, but it must be with the consent of architect without withstanding anything expressed or implied in the contract. This gives another meanings of breach of the contract. So for the Clause 16.2, the employer can occupy without consent from architect and without prejudice to any right and remedies because of the several reasons, which are the completion of works has been delayed and a certificate of non-completion has been issued by the architect under Clause 22.2. The next point is certificate of partial completion. For the PWD in Clause 42.1a, CPC is issued by the Superintendent Officer. It must be within 7 days from the date possession of relevant part, and it must be stated estimate value of relevant part. For the PAM 2018, it is in the clause 16.1a and 16.2a. CPC is issued by the architect within 14 days from the date employer taking possession towards occupied part. And certificate of partial completion also need to state estimate value of relevant part. Relevant part there is any sections or part that the employer wish to occupy. The next one is defect liability periods. For the PWD, it is in the clause 42.1b, which DLP is applied when relevant part or section has reached practical completion, and it is valid on the date government have taken possession. For the PAM 2018, it is stated in both clause 16.1b and 16.2b. The DLP is taken place when practical completion of occupied part is occurred, and it also valid on the date employer taken possession. For the certificate of making good defects, for PWD, it is highlighted in the clause 42.1c, which CMGD is issued by the superintendent officer and at the end of defects liability period. For the PAM 2018, it is also in both clause 16.1e and 16.2e, which CMGD is issued by architect and issued when any defects in occupied part or section has been making good. For example, if the contractor fix any defects in any section of part that the employer wish to occupy, so that he will be issued the certificate of making good defects. Another differences is liquidated damages. For the PWD, in clause 42.1d, LAD has to reduce in the proportions which the value of the relevant part bears to the contract sum. And for the PAM 2018, in the clause 16.1c and 16.2c, LAD will be reduced proportionally by ratio of estimated value of the occupied part to contract sum. LAD is the estimate of otherwise intangible or hard to define losses to one of the parties. So, if the work is already done for any sections or parts that occupied first, so the LAD for that part is so there is no more LAD for that part. That is why the LAD for the project will be reduced proportionally. The last point is guarantee from contractor. In PWD, as highlighted in the clause 42.1f, the guarantee is called as performance bond. It is released after the completion of making good defects during DLP and after certificate of completion of making good defects for the whole work is given. For the for the PAM 2018, as mentioned in the clause 16.1f and 16.2f, the guarantee is called as retention fund. Retention fund has the same function as the performance bond. It is open issuance of CPC. Half amount of retention fund in the ratio of estimated value of occupied part to contract sum is released. For example, if the retention fund is 5%, so it is 2.5% of retention fund is released upon issuance of CPC, and the remaining of retention fund, which is another 2.5%, will be released after the CMGD is issued. Last but not least is the comparison between sectional completion and partial occupations. For the sectional completion, the employer's intent must be known to the contractor in the tender documents. Meanwhile, for the partial occupation, the employer's intent must be known to the contractor during progress of work. For the sectional completion, the relevant sections must be specified earlier in the tender documents, while for the partial occupation, the employer can take any positions of any parts of the work that has been completed. The next one is sectional completion do not require contractor concerns, but the partial occupations need consent from contractor is mandatory prior to occupations. For sectional completion, the certificate of practical completion is issued upon the practical completion of the relevant sections. but difference in the partial occupation, which the section occupied is deemed to have reached practical completion, but no certificate of practical completion is issued. The last point is sectional completion has separate and different liquidated and ascertained damages for each section is already mentioned in the appendix. Meanwhile, for the partial occupations, for the remainder of works, liquidated and ascertained damages shall be reduced accordingly. So that's all from us. Thank you.